There I was, standing at the edge of my own soybean field, boots sunk in mud, watching a $220,000 wedding tent flap like some royal circus pavilion in the wind. String lights danced overhead, a string quartet struggled against the bass thumping from rented speakers, and a sea of strangers in stilettos were stomping all over my freshly sprouted soybeans like they were walking a red carpet. I could smell the lavender-scented table linens and overpriced champagne wafting in the breeze, as if this whole charade wasn't happening on my land without so much as a knock on the door. That's when a man in a crisp black vest, some hotshot caterer with too much gel in his hair, marched up to me like I was the help and said, "Hey, sir, do you mind moving your tractor? It's kinda ruining the aesthetic." My John Deere sat at the edge of the field, still caked in the honest dirt of the morning's work, and now was apparently a blemish on this woman's Pinterest wedding fantasy. I looked at the guy, then at the tent, then at the deep tire ruts left by their rental trucks, tearing through my property like it was their backyard. That was the moment. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I just turned to the machine, flipped one switch, and listened to the low mechanical growl of the manure spreaders roar to life. Let's just say the party took a turn. They were screams. Real ones. Tables flipped, chairs toppled, people scattered like pigeons in a thunderstorm. The caterer's white shirt went brown before he even turned around. A bridesmaid slipped in something she probably didn't want to identify. I just stood there, arms crossed, watching the chaos unfold, as if it were the most satisfying movie scene I'd ever seen. But before the first phone camera could even upload the madness to social media, before the news vans showed up or the bride could scream about her ruined centerpieces, I knew this wasn't the beginning of the story. No, this was the fallout, the punchline, the grand finale of a slow-burn war that started months earlier, long before the first folding chair touched my land. So how did it come to this? Let's rewind. See, I'm the sheriff of a quiet Appalachian county where folks still wave when they pass you on the road, even if they don't like you. I served 20 years in the military before I came home to take care of my father after his first stroke. He passed last spring and left me the land and the hunting lodge he built with his bare hands, 30 years of sweat and sawdust. That lodge wasn't just a building, it was his cathedral, and when I stood on the porch with the morning fog curling through the trees, I finally understood what he meant. It wasn't just timber and nails, it was legacy, family, the last piece of him I had left. And that legacy, it caught the eye of a woman who'd never worked a day in the dirt but decided my land didn't match her vision board. Her name was Deborah Witherspoon, self-declared queen of the Sycamore Bluff HOA, the kind of woman who smells like lemon pledge and litigation. And what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I wasn't just some backwoods redneck with a badge. I was patient, I was prepared, and I had nothing left to lose. I didn't always expect to end up back in the same county where I grew up, especially not wearing a badge. But life has a way of dragging you back to your roots when you least expect it. After 20 years in the military, I'd seen enough sand and steel to last a lifetime. My plan was to retire somewhere quiet, maybe take up woodworking like my dad always talked about. But then he had his first stroke, and that changed everything. I came home, hung up my uniform, and stepped into a different kind of duty. He passed last spring, quietly, the way he lived, and left me the land, along with the hunting lodge he built with nothing but calloused hands and stubborn grit. He used to call that lodge his cathedral, and back then I didn't understand it, but now, waking up with the sunrise pouring through pine needles, standing on the porch with coffee steaming in the cold air, I get it. It wasn't just a building, it was memory, sacrifice, blood in the boards. And more than anything, it was peace. Until she showed up, Deborah Witherspoon. HOA president, divorcee with a vengeance, the type of woman who thinks a clipboard and a fake smile can substitute for common sense. She moved into the cul-de-sac at the edge of my property a couple years ago, the kind of person who complains about the chirping of birds because it disrupts her meditation playlist. I didn't pay her much mind at first. She was just another face behind the hedges, waving stiffly at community barbecues and glaring at anyone who parked slightly off-center. That was until she discovered the lodge, my father's lodge. Technically speaking, it sits just outside the boundary line of the Sycamore Bluff HOA. And I do mean just 10 feet. 10 feet outside her little fiefdom, not part of the HOA. Never was, never will be. But you wouldn't know that from the way she came marching up my gravel driveway one Saturday morning like she was delivering orders from Mount Sinai. I was halfway through replacing a storm shutter when I heard it, the sharp clack of high heels on gravel, which should have been my first warning. Nobody with good intentions wears heels on a farm. I turned, And there she was, standing at the bottom of my porch steps, with a look on her face like she'd just sniffed something unpleasant. Clipboard in hand, lips pursed, posture straight as a broomstick. "Hi there," she chirped, in the tone people use when they're about to sell you something. Or take something away. "I'm Deborah Witherspoon, HOA president for Sycamore Bluff. We've had a few complaints about your structure." She said the word structure like it personally offended her. I set down my hammer, wiped my hands on a rag, and raised an eyebrow. "You mean the lodge? My father's lodge?" She gave me a tight, practiced smile. "Yes, well, the logs are untreated and your wood pile is visible from the road. It's just not cohesive with the community aesthetic." I looked past her, at the miles of forest stretching into the hills, not a single house in sight. The community? You mean the raccoons? That didn't go over well. Her nose flared and she handed me a stapled packet of papers like it was a holy scripture. "These are the HOA guidelines. Section 8 covers structure visibility, landscaping, and color palettes." I didn't even take the packet. I just looked her dead in the eyes and said, "I'm not in the HOA." Her smile twitched, cracked just a bit. "You're adjacent to it, and that has visual impact. We're trying to preserve property values." Property values? On land my family has owned since 1952. That lodge stood before her subdivision had so much as a street sign. I told her that plainly. I told her that unless her bylaws were signed by God himself, they didn't apply to me. I thought that would be the end of it, but it wasn't, because people like Deborah Witherspoon don't stop when you say no. They hear no as a challenge, a dare. The next week, signs started appearing along the gravel road leading to my house. "Private HOA residents only," laminated, staked into the dirt like they had the weight of law behind them. She even made up a logo. One of the signs blocked the trailhead I used for hiking. Another covered half the wooden sign my father carved by hand decades ago, "Welcome to Fox Hollow." I ripped every last one of them out and burned them in my fire pit that night. The next morning, they were back. Then came the envelopes, white, crisp, official-looking, stamped with that same fake HOA logo. Violation, unauthorized structure, unapproved fire pit, violation, wildlife attractant, apparently leaving corn out for deer now constituted criminal negligence in Deborah's world. I filed a cease and desist, cited property law, zoning lines, and common damn sense. I even offered to meet civilly and explain where her authority ended. She responded by forwarding my name to the utility company. A week later, I came home to a dark house, no storm, no downed lines, just gone, disconnected. I called the power company, and the lady on the line said a complaint had been filed. Safety hazard, uninhabited structure, immediate risk. I had to fax over land deeds and legal documentation just to get the lights turned back on. That's when I knew. This wasn't neighborly concern or community standards. This was war, a slow, creeping invasion dressed up in khakis and HOA letterhead. And what she didn't realize, not yet, was that I had been trained for longer, harder fights than this. She had a clipboard. I had time. And I wasn't about to let my father's legacy get erased by a woman who thought wildflowers were weeds. The thing about people like Deborah Witherspoon is that they don't back off. They double down. When polite threats don't work, they try paperwork. When paperwork fails, they escalate. And that's exactly what she did. The week after she had my power shut off, I noticed new signs popping up again, this time more elaborate. She had laminated them, made them look official, even included fake city codes and citations printed in bold red letter. They were nailed to fence posts, trees, even one slapped right on my tool shed like a scarlet letter. The kicker was one sign that read, "Future site of Sycamore Bluff Nature Park, sponsored by your HOA. Nature Park, on my land, without permission." She didn't stop there. I started receiving fake fines in the mail. Envelopes typed with perfect alignment, her phony HOA logo in the corner. Violation codes that sounded real until you realized they were complete nonsense. I was fined for my fire pit, my stacked woodpile, the barn paint color, and for leaving out corn for the deer, which apparently was a dangerous wildlife attractant. There were warnings about liens, about property seizures, about further action if I failed to comply. All of it was fake, but it was relentless. It wasn't just me. I started hearing from neighbors, older folks, single moms, people working 2 jobs just to get by. Deborah had been doing the same thing to them, threatening them with violations that didn't exist, bullying them into silence, charging dues no one had agreed to. One woman told me Deborah had made her remove a birdbath because it wasn't an approved water feature. Another man was fined for using Christmas lights that weren't in the HOA colored palette. The guy was Jewish. She fined his menorah. There was control, not order, not safety, just raw, entitled control. And she wanted the lodge gone. That became obvious. Every time I stood on the porch, I catch glimpses of her Lexus creeping past, slow enough to make sure I saw it. Once she even had the nerve to take pictures of my property from across the tree line, probably to use in her next batch of bogus complaints. But the line was crossed when I came home one evening and found a pile of construction waste dumped along the creek behind my barn. Old siding, drywall, half-empty paint cans, busted-up toilets. Not the kind of trash that just shows up by accident. I followed the tire tracks leading to it. They matched the same pattern as the HOA landscaper's trailer. I reported it, cleaned it up myself, and then I built a sign. Big, bold letters burned into oak. Private land, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. I posted it right at the edge of the property line, simple and clear. The next morning it was gone. Not just gone, replaced. In its place stood a shiny plastic sign with rounded edges and pastel colors. Future HOA Recreation Area. Community Trail coming soon. It was more than disrespect at this point. It was a calculated land grab. Deborah had convinced herself that if she harassed me long enough, I'd give up. Sell the land, walk away. Let her roll over everything my father built like it was just another landscaping project on her to-do list. But what she didn't understand was that every fake fine, every planted sign, every smug smile just hardened my resolve. I stopped reacting. I stopped answering her letters. I started documenting everything. I dug out my old trail cameras, the kind we used for monitoring deer patterns during hunting season, and mounted them in the trees. Motion triggered, cloud synced, nearly invisible. Every sign she moved, every inch she trespassed, every attempt to tamper with my land, I caught it. I built a file, digital and physical, photos, letters, timelines. I wasn't going to swing first, but I was going to be ready when the time came. Then came the wedding. I hadn't heard a thing about it. No notice, no request. Just woke up one morning to find trucks rolling across my field like a convoy. White tents going up, speakers getting wired in, florists and caterers and rental crews buzzing like they owned the place. When I stepped outside, confused and already irritated, a woman with a headset looked me up and down and said, "Oh, we thought this field was part of the HOA. Guy said we could use it." Claimed she had verbal approval. I asked from who. She gave me a name that didn't exist. And just like that, a private wedding was in full swing on my soybean crop. Tables, carpets, porta potties, stilettos sinking into the dirt. Nobody asked, nobody cared. Not until I stood beside my tractor and that caterer asked me to move it for aesthetic reasons. That was the moment the whole thing changed. And the manure spreader did exactly what it was built to do. What they didn't know, what no one outside my inner circle realized yet, was that everything they were doing, every smug invasion of space, every phony threat, was being recorded. This wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. This was the setup for something much bigger. And Deborah Witherspoon had no idea she had already lost. When I flipped that switch on the manure spreader, I knew I was crossing a line, but I didn't care. That wedding was the last straw. The sight of silk tablecloths fluttering over my soybean rows, of rented crystal glasses catching the sun like they belonged there, of strangers laughing and stomping through the soil my father once bled into it, flipped something in me. And when the spray started, when that perfect white tent got its first streak of brown, and the crowd realized what was happening, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Satisfaction. It wasn't about revenge. It was about setting a boundary with the only language Deborah Witherspoon understood. The wedding chaos made the rounds online before the night was over. People posted clips with captions like, "Redneck Wedding Revenge," and "HOA gets a taste of the country." But while the internet laughed, I stayed quiet. I knew Deborah wouldn't let it go, and I was right. 2 days later, I got a call from dispatch while I was in town grabbing supplies. "There's smoke near the ridge," they said, "near the lodge." I didn't ask questions. I hit the sirens and drove like hell, and before I even saw the plume of black curling into the sky, before the ash hit my windshield and the acrid bite hit the back of my throat, I already knew she'd taken it further. Too far. The lodge was gone. Flames had swallowed it whole, eating through the 30 years of my father's sweat and patience like it was kindling. The roof had collapsed inward. The porch was a black skeleton. The old elk head above the mantel, the one we mounted together when I was 12, nothing but ash. I stood there as the firefighters soaked the perimeter, trying to keep the blaze from jumping to the trees, and my hands shook with fury I hadn't felt since the battlefield. Chief Charlie walked up, helmet in hand, and didn't need to say anything. But he did anyway. "We found a gas can," he said quietly. "Off to the side. Hidden in the brush. Could be trash," I said, knowing it wasn't. "There's more," he said. "The ignition point's not natural. Accelerants. Multiple trails, boot prints, not firefighter prints. Tactical treads, size 8, maybe 9, and right then I saw it. I saw her, standing in the local army surplus store 2 weeks earlier, haggling over camouflage jackets she called couture combat wear, the boots, the same ones. I didn't say a word, just nodded, turned, and drove straight back to the station. I'd installed wildlife cams all around the lodge weeks ago, motion-signed, cloud-synced, hidden up in the rafters and tree lines. I sat at my desk, opened the laptop, and scrawled through hours of footage. Squirrels, birds, wind, then her Deborah Witherspoon, in full camo, creeping along the side of the lodge with a red gas can in hand, pausing to look over her shoulder, then pouring liquid in a slow circle. She lit it with a rag, dropped it, watched it catch, and smiled. She didn't wear a mask, not even a scarf, just that smug little grin like she was lighting a candle, not burning down a legacy. I paused the video on her face glowing in the firelight. I could have gone to her house right then, slapped cuffs on her in front of her garden club. But I didn't, because this wasn't just about fire anymore. This was about the campaign, the signs, the fake fines, the threats, the power outage, the dump site, the wedding, and now, this. Arson. I wasn't going to stop at arrest. I was going to dismantle everything she'd built quietly, methodically, legally, because Deborah didn't just burn down a building, she woke something up in me, and she had no idea what was coming next. I knew I had her. The footage alone was enough to put Deborah behind bars for arson, but I wasn't interested in a simple arrest. No, I wanted the whole truth dragged into the light like rot under a flipped stone. I wanted every lie, every forged fine, every bogus rule she had ever forced on good people to be exposed for what it was, fabrication and control. So I started digging. I pulled every letter she'd ever sent me, every notice, every flyer with that fake HOA logo. I called the gas station where she filled up the red can and got security footage of her paying in cash, wearing that same ridiculous camo jacket she thought made her look tactical. I spoke to neighbors, lots of them, folks who had been fined for having the wrong mailbox color or growing unapproved flowers in their yard. One woman, Miss Lorna, had her backyard bird bath dismantled because it wasn't a regulation water feature. Another man named Bill got a notice claiming his menorah violated the HOA's holiday light policy. Deborah's empire was built on fear and fake authority, targeting people who wouldn't or couldn't fight back. Until now. Then came the real discovery. The HOA charter she waved around like a holy book? It was never legally filed with the county. Not a single signature was notarized. Half of them were copied from a yard sale sign-in sheet. She literally forged an entire board of directors and declared herself president for life without ever holding an election. And when I reached out to those so-called board members, most of them didn't even know they were on it. One guy thought he'd signed up for a neighborhood chili cook-off. It would have been funny if it hadn't been so sinister. She created an illusion of power, wrapped in bureaucracy, and used it to bully an entire community. But the icing on the cake, the fatal mistake, was what she did next. Just 3 days after the fire, I got a call from the county clerk. My deputy sounded confused. "You need to see this in person," he said. So I drove down, and there it was. Deborah had filed a permit application with her signature on it, claiming that my land, the scorched remains of my father's lodge, was being conditionally annexed into the Sycamore Bluff HOA. She filed paperwork claiming ownership of land she didn't own. That wasn't just unethical, that was a legal nuke. Fraud, forgery, attempted land theft. I finally had the trigger I needed, not just to arrest her, but to burn down her entire fake kingdom from the inside out. I filed a full report with the district attorney, submitted every piece of evidence, from the video of the arson to the fake signatures on the charter. I made sure her actions weren't just seen as aggressive neighbor behavior, but as organized fraud with criminal intent. Meanwhile, I coordinated with other victims. We met quietly, shared stories, cross-referenced fines and threats. I found a pattern. She targeted the vulnerable, widows, veterans, single parents, immigrants, people who didn't have the time or the resources to fight back. She used fake lawyers, fake warnings, and the fear of liens to squeeze money from people who just wanted to be left alone. And now, one by one, those people were ready to stand with me. Deborah had no idea any of this was happening. She kept sending out newsletters, kept acting like queen of the cul-de-sac. She even called a community meeting to smear my name, handing out blurry photos of me at a gas station with captions like, "Sheriff unhinged and dangerous." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The truth was already marching toward her with the weight of law behind it. And when I heard she'd tried to enter the burned remains of the lodge with a so-called consultant to appraise the site, for community development, I drove out there myself. She was standing in the ashes of what she'd destroyed, holding a measuring tape and acting like the land already belonged to her. When I told her she was trespassing and that another charge was about to be added to her growing list, the color drained from her face. She stammered something about community insurance and annexation rights, but the lie died in her throat when I said the words she wasn't ready to hear. "Deborah, you're not the president of anything. You're a fraud, and you're about to be arrested." I filed the arrest warrant myself the next morning, walked it into the courthouse and made sure every box was checked. Every charge clearly listed arson, fraud, impersonating an official, filing false claims, harassment, wire tampering, property damage, and about a half-dozen other crimes stacked like bricks in a wall that was about to fall on her head. The judge didn't even blink before signing off. I had the evidence, the motive, the paper trail, and the boots on the ground. But I wasn't done yet. I made a few calls, reached out to the people she had bullied and silenced, the same folks who had kept their heads down for years because they thought they were alone. I asked if they wanted to see justice firsthand, and they showed up in lawn chairs with coolers and folding fans and whip-bound homemade, some of them laughing like they hadn't laughed in months. One guy brought a Bluetooth speaker and played the national anthem on repeat. When we rolled up to her pristine White House, Deborah Witherspoon was holding another HOA meeting on her front lawn, surrounded by banners and clipboards like she was still in charge. She was mid-sentence, complaining about someone's fence color, when I stepped onto the grass with my deputies and called her name, Deborah Witherspoon. She turned, annoyed at first, then confused, and finally pale, as she saw the badge, the cuffs, the crowd. I read every charge out loud. Her face changed with each word: anger, disbelief, then panic. She shouted that it was a mistake, that I couldn't arrest her, that she was the president. I held up the warrant. "This says otherwise." As we walked her to the cruiser, the neighbors she tormented clapped and cheered. Someone popped a confetti cannon. Another shouted, "God bless due process." She tried to throw herself onto her flower bed in some dramatic protest, but my deputy just raised an eyebrow and helped her up like she was a drunk ant at a barbecue. I didn't smile. Not yet. Court day came quicker than I expected, not because the system moves fast, it usually doesn't, but because I made it my personal mission to ensure every T was crossed and every I dotted. The courtroom wasn't packed, but the people who mattered were there. Miss Lorna with her photo of the bird bath that started it all, Bill holding the HOA violation for his menorah, others with stacks of fake fines, threats, and newsletters filled with lies. Deborah walked in wearing a beige pantsuit like she was attending a corporate brunch, flanked by a lawyer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. She tried to spin the arson as a misunderstanding, claimed she was clearing brush and didn't know the lodge had value, said the structure was abandoned, that she was protecting the community. Her lawyer used words like administrative error and civic duty. Then I played the footage, crystal clear, her pouring gasoline, lighting the rag, watching the flames catch like it was a 4th of July sparkler. The courtroom went silent. Even her lawyer stopped talking. The judge paused, leaned forward, and asked for the video to be played again. After that, it wasn't about guilt. It was about how guilty. The sentence was brutal. 5 years probation, hundreds of hours of community service, and full restitution, not just for the lodge, but for emotional damages, property destruction, and legal fees. The final number made her flinch. Over $800,000. Her insurance didn't cover intentional arson, which meant the court went after her assets, her savings, her car, her house. The fake HOA, already under investigation, was formally dissolved. Every fine she had ever issued, every threat, every fabricated document, null and void, and just to make sure she couldn't crawl out of the wreckage and try this again in another town, I filed a civil suit, not for the money. I already had insurance coverage for part of the loss. I did it to make the truth public. Every fake signature, every abuse of power, every lie set in ink. I wanted it on the record in black and white for every future neighbor or community to read. She didn't just lose, she was erased. And the cherry on top? Court-ordered community service. I drove past the county park one afternoon, and there she was in a neon vest, scrubbing graffiti off a picnic table she once tried to claim as private HOA. A group of teens recorded her on their phones. One of them yelled, "Hey, aren't you the lady who burned down a lodge?" And she turned away from the camera like the sun had slapped her. Meanwhile, the neighborhood she ruled with an iron clipboard through a barbecue. Real food, loud music, kids laughing, no rules, no fines, just people. Miss Lorna brought me a plate of ribs and said it felt like the end of a very long winter. She was right. As for the lodge, I rebuilt it. Not the same, of course. Some things can't be replaced. But stronger, fireproof materials, solar panels, reinforced frame, and out front I built a new wooden sign in the style of my dad's original, but with one small addition burned into the grain. Box Hollow Lodge, Karen proof since 2024.